So the biggest bottleneck on most people's property business and scaling their property business is going to be their ability to fund deals, i.e. access to capital. The first bottleneck is deal flow and access to deals, and that's a skill that can be learned that you would have heard me talked about in a few other videos. But if you can find deals, and there is an abundance of deals out there, a lot of people struggle with finding and the ability to fund property development deals. A lot of people, when they're first starting out their property journey, they think, or even those not in the property world, they think they only rely on use their own capital to fund deals, which of course is when it becomes a bottleneck, because your own capital is a finite resource. You only have so much of your own money. Unfortunately, we don't all have unlimited pots of cash. And so if you really want to scale your property business, you need to figure out, okay, how can you continue to fund property deals without being dependent on your own money? And if you look at any of the biggest players in the property space, playing at the absolute top of the game with property portfolios and businesses in the hundreds of billions, like the big private equity real estate firms, they've managed to achieve that because they've raised money from property from other investors, and same with the likes of Donald Trump or anyone else. You'll find that they are masters at raising capital, and they're not dependent on using their own money. They're masters at finding deals, they're masters at structuring the deals and raising the money and working with investors, and then of course I've got the operations and the management to deliver it. And so when it comes to funding your property deals, and with our property development business, we've got deal sizes where the total cost on the project, the one in Cambridgeshire that we can openly talk about, is about 6 million. A couple other sites we've got in the pipeline are about £6.5–7 million, which is similar. And of course, we've got to essentially find a way to fund those costs, because someone's got to pay the contractors, someone's got to pay the professional fees, someone's got to pay the abnormals, the Section 106, etc. But these are the same principles, even if it's a much smaller property. And so the first thing you can understand is, of course, the banks will be able to provide the majority of the money in the form of debt. So with a small residential property, this is going to be a mortgage. If it's a ground up development, that's going to be development finance. If you're buying sort of a big built asset that's already there, maybe a cash flowing asset, it's going to be a more kind of bespoke commercial loan. And these banks are going to be giving you the majority of the funds. Now, depending on the leverage, depending on the deal, it could be 50% of the money required, it could be 60%. If it's a residential mortgage, of course, banks will give you 90%, even with some ground up developments, depending on the deal. If you have different layers of capital, like a senior debt facility and a mezzanine loan facility, you can get loan to values 90% plus. But what's important to understand is the banks will pretty much always lend money if you can meet certain criteria. The deal stacks, they're happy with you as an individual, and depending on the deal and the size of the deal is going to determine the level of due diligence they're going to do, and it's going to determine the amount of lenders that are available. But a really key point to understand, and this is something that I heard once and it stuck with me ever since, is rarely is access to debt the problem, because if you have enough equity to put into the deal, you'll always be able to find the debt, pretty much, assuming of course the things we said. And so as a property entrepreneur, yes, you need to be good at building relationships with banks. You need to get good at finding deals and structuring deals that banks are going to want to lend against. But it's finding the equity that's the important thing. Now, if you don't understand the difference between debt and equity, debt is essentially money you borrow from a lender, and pretty much all the time it's a fixed interest rate that you pay back, or a variable interest rate, but it's an interest rate that's agreed. It's a certain amount of interest over a period of time, and that interest can be paid back in many ways. It can be paid back in full, along with the full principal of the loan at the end. It can be paid back monthly, a serviced interest. But equity is kind of the risk money that's being put into the deal. Again, using the example of a small buy-to-let property, the equity is the deposit. It's the money you're putting in because the banks want to see skin in the game from the borrower. With a ground-up development, if it's £6 million total costs, our lender might be happy to give us £5 million, but they're going to want to see £1 million put in from us as a developer. But this is where equity gets really interesting, and equity is, there are many different ways equity can be structured, and I don't want to get too complex, but essentially it's a profit share, because at the end of the deal, or when there's a future liquidity event, rather if it's a sale of the asset, for example, so it's a ground up development, you build the units and you go to sell, that's a liquidity event where when money comes back into the deal from the sale of the units, and that money of course is going to pay back the first charge, the senior debt lender first. If there's a second charge, they're going to get paid back second, and then of course you've got the equity investors that get paid back. And that's just basics of the capital stack, and I've talked about the capital stack in a bit more detail in again other videos. Capital stack is just the different layers of capital, the different layers of debt and the equity, and the priority they have in payout when there is a liquidity event, which could also be a refinance. So when you refinance an asset, it's a new flow of money coming into the deal from the new lender you're refinancing with, or it could be the same lender on a new product, and that pays back the original loan plus, depending on the amount of money, any sort of other investors in the deal. So when there's a liquidity event, the investors are essentially getting a share of the profits or a share of the distributions. And so when putting equity into the deal, not all of the time that money has to come from you. And this is where it gets really interesting, because you'll hear people say you can do property deals with no money. Well, that's not necessarily true. There is a lot of time there's going to be, in order to buy an asset at least, it's going to require some money. It's just a question of where that money comes from. Can you do deals with none of your own money? Yes, absolutely. Can you do deals with no money? Not really. There's creative things you can do with contracts where you're flipping on contracts, but even then it's going to incur a bit of legal costs. But if we're talking about buying and owning and developing assets, there's going to be some money that's been required. So of that equity piece, so let's say on a deal of £2 million, and you can get a loan facility for £1.5 million of that, you're going to have to find £500,000 worth of equity. Now the lender, of course, they're going to want to see some skin in the game from the borrower. They're going to want to see some equity input. So this is where you have to learn the difference between joint venture partners and passive equity investors. And so a joint venture partner is essentially someone that's going to become a director of the business with you. They are very much going to become a business partner. They're going to take on the liability, the debt with you. They're taking on all of the risk of the deal. And of course, with most joint ventures, it could be a 50-50 profit share split. If there's two partners, they're both providing equal amounts of value. One person's finding the deal, one person's managing the deal, delivering the deal, the other person is funding the deal. They split the profits 50-50. But of course it doesn't have to be 50-50, it could be 60-40, it could be a joint venture, it can be anything. The point being is within the company that's set up to deliver that deal, the special purpose vehicle, the joint venture partner is the same classification of shares as you. You'll have a separate kind of joint venture agreement or a shareholder agreement, which is a similar thing, and you guys are very much equal in that sense. And the benefit of a joint venture partner, especially to get to the bigger loan sizes, for example with us in our property development business, we're at a point now where the loan sizes, I think the most recent one is a loan facility of £5.2 million. The lenders want us to personally guarantee a percentage of that. They want us to sign personal guarantees just to hold us accountable. So what they don't want us doing is just, if something goes wrong with the deal, we dissolve the SPV, and of course that means we're not liable for the debts, but the personal guarantee links us personally, so it just adds that layer of accountability. But the lenders don't want us signing personal guarantees if we actually don't have sort of the net worth or the assets to back up that personal guarantee. And so they want to see kind of what assets and liabilities we have, what's our balance sheet, what other properties do we own, what other income streams do we have. They want to get a full picture of us. And so when you get to the bigger loan sizes, often a bottleneck occurs and a constraint occurs, is that where you don't have the assets and liabilities to give the lender sufficient confidence that they can lend you the money, and if things go wrong, you've got other assets you can refinance or sell in order to help contribute towards paying down this loan, which is where a joint venture partner comes in. So right now we're looking at some bigger deals that we want to play. Our next plays after the kind of residential schemes we're looking at, and these are going to be deals where the GDVs are in the tens of millions, the total costs are going to be in the tens of millions, which means the loan facilities are also going to be sort of in the 8 figures. And if we want to grow our property business, us as young property entrepreneurs, although we might be great at finding deals, great at management, we know how to structure the deals, the constraint is going to be, well, do we have the assets and liabilities to give the lenders confidence? No. So this joint venture partner can come into the deal, they can put the money in, they can be a signatory on the bank, or they can take on the liability of the debt and are happy to support the loan. They then have the balance sheet, the assets and liabilities to give the lenders confidence. So that's where a joint venture partner comes in. But you can have a mix of equity in the deal, so then you can have passive investors that come into the deal. And this is what we did for the most recent Cambridgeshire project, where the total equity we're raising is about, I want to say 1.1 to 1.2 million pounds. I forget the exact number without looking at the spreadsheet in front of me. The majority of those funds came from passive investors. Passive investors meaning they're not involved in the day-to-day management of the project. They're not a director of the SPV, they are a shareholder, and they sit as a different classification of shares, and they have a separate shareholder agreement with a separate profit share, and they are also priority shares in this case, so they get their equity paid back first before us, so the developers receive our equity. Of course, they have to get paid, the banks have to get paid back first before they get paid back, but they're not taking on the risk of the debt. If something goes wrong with a loan, the banks aren't going to be calling on those passive investors, etc. And so you can essentially do a mix of both. You can have a joint venture partner in, put in 5 to 10% of the equity piece, for example, which is what some lenders want to see, and then some lenders are happy for the remaining equity to be coming from passive investors, which are going to be at lower profit share, they're going to be a slightly lower ROI. So there are some creative ways you can structure it. Of course, if you're in a fortunate position where, let's say, the equity requirement is £500,000 and the lenders are happy for 100, maybe £200,000 of that to come, they want to see 100 to £200,000 of that come from the developer, which is you, then they're happy for the rest to be from passive investors. So you might not need a joint venture partner, you might just want to have sort of passive equity investors investing in the deal. So there are other ways to fund property deals at a much smaller level, with kind of private loan agreements, raising working capital into your limited company, but that's not really scalable. It comes with a lot of admin, and it can almost become a house of cards in some sense, where I see a lot of people, they're raising £25,000 on a private loan agreement here, £50,000 here, £100,000 here, they're getting into this deal, out of that deal. The money isn't used specifically for one project, it is more just kind of working capital. But then the trouble is, if you can't sell that asset or refinance that one of your assets in time to pay back a loan that's coming to the end of this agreement, you're then raising money from this person to pay back this person, and it gets a little bit messy. The benefit of raising equity is that it's deal specific, and the investors are taking on the risk of the deal with you. So if there are any questions about any of that, drop a comment below this video and I'll try my best to answer them, or maybe I'll do another video to clarify things further. And I'm also going to put a link to a video where I talked about funding property deals in a bit more detail, so if you want to learn more about that, check the link in the description.